All right, good morning, everybody. Just before we get started, I'm going to let the participants all roll in. There's quite a few people joining, so I'm watching the numbers tick up, and we'll just ensure that everybody gets into the town hall first and that we've got our live streaming working okay. Andre, maybe if you're online, you could just confirm for me that the live stream's working okay out on the YouTube channel and also John's Facebook.
Yep, YouTube is live.
Okay, great.
Just checking Facebook now.
It's lovely seeing all the good morning messages.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone, because I'm very nervous. So really appreciate your encouragement sending those messages.
Yeah.
All right, we'll just give about another 30 seconds, everyone. I see the numbers still ticking up on the bottom before we get underway.
See, my wife has appeared as a panelist via my son. I might have to yell out to her to knock off. See, my wife has appeared as a panelist via my son. I might have to yell out to her to knock off. See, my wife has appeared as a panelist via my son. I might have to.
All right, numbers still rolling in, but let's get underway, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us for this critically important town hall meeting today, hosted by Liberal Democrats lead New South Wales Senate candidate, Mr. John Ruddick. My name's Keith Cullen. I'm an electorate manager with the Liberal Democrats. John, thanks so much for the opportunity to help you produce today's event. It really is a fabulous initiative that I'm sure a lot of people are very thankful for you conceiving of and bringing together. So now that everybody seems to be rolling in and the live feeds are up and running, I'll just take a moment to explain the format for today. So we've set up a town hall style format. We've invited a limited number of people, it's actually a few hundred, participating directly into the Zoom feed, which means they'll be able to participate in the question and answer session. As far as questions and answers go, I see everybody putting nice messages in the chat section over to the right-hand side of your screens. When it comes to questions and answers that you'd like either an individual panelist or the panel as a whole to address, is if you can put them in the specific Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. We might pick some of those up as we go through the session today. I'll keep an eye out on them and I'm able to talk to the panelists and refer them to them if we do that. But whatever we don't get through as we're progressing throughout the session, is we'll come and have a formal Q&A session at the conclusion of the presentations and the panel discussion. I just ask that with your questions that you drop into the Q&A, if you can let us know at the top if you would like them just generally put to the panel or whether you'd like to address them to a specific panelist, that'll help us direct those. We're live streaming on YouTube and also John's Facebook page. If you're not already following both the Liberal Democrat YouTube channel and John's Facebook pages, please make sure that you do that. John's been putting a lot of good content out over the last week or so, and on Twitter as well. If you can follow John on Twitter, and the other panelists might talk to their Twitter handles as well, or search them up is I think the more of us that are sharing information and ideas, the better. And social media is obviously the way to do that. In terms of the YouTube channel, I just say to everybody that we're hoping we're going to have the live stream prevail, but many of you might have seen during the week that YouTube's embarking on what it calls a crackdown on misinformation, and seems to be that anything that doesn't suit the narrative is misinformation as far as YouTube's concerned. So a little bit hesitant about that today. We're hoping that the nature of today's topic, workers' rights and workplace rights and the difficult position that people are finding themselves in, is not going to be considered as misinformation. It obviously is anything but, as far as we're all concerned. So we don't think we'll find ourselves victim of that sort of censorship. But if we do, for any reason, as we are recording today's session, and we'll do our best to make it available in recorded form later. So let's get on with the event, please. As John Ruddick, I'll introduce to you as our New South Wales Senate candidate for the Lib Dems in the upcoming federal election. I'll let John introduce himself once he starts speaking. And again, John's hosting today's event, and again, a great initiative. We're joined today by John Larter. Many of you may have caught John on various media outlets over the past couple of months. John is a paramedic, I think, John, of 20 plus years standing. He's a dad with 6 kids, so that's a heroic effort by he and his wife in of itself, really. And John's also Deputy Mayor of the Snowy Valley Council in southern New South Wales, and recently found himself suspended by the Paramedicine Board for his stance against mandatory vaccinations, and has since launched a legal action in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Joining us also today, Robert McCauley. And Robert is a senior litigation partner with PTW Solicitors here in Sydney, and an experienced advocate of both public and private organisations and individuals seeking to resolve legal disputes. And Robert's representing John in his Supreme Court action against Health Minister Brad Hazzard. Really pleased to be joined by, in union circles, I'll say public enemy number one as far as Sally McManus is concerned, Jack Maguire, who is the Chief Executive of Red Union, an organisation that assists workers and professionals in getting themselves organised into their own association in circumstances where they find themselves let down by the traditional union movement. And Jack's been instrumental in the establishment and operation of the Teachers Professional Association and Nurses Professional Associations of Queensland, which have recently become professional associations Australia-wide. And we're really delighted to have Jack join us today. David Porter joins us. He's the one that's in the lovely picnic spot down in Victoria. David is a retired lawyer of several decades of practice, but also now an active truffle farmer. And I'll leave David to explain that to you. But we asked David to come along and talk specifically about an excellent piece that he wrote in The Spectator earlier this week, entitled "Limiting Access for Unvaxxed to Public Places Will Likely Breach the Disability Discrimination Act." And that's a topic that we're really keen to explore today. And Angela Keptus is with us today, another of our special guests. And Angela is a school safety and risk management specialist of many years' experience in the independent school sector. And she'll be talking about issues around risk mitigation in the workplace, particularly as it pertains to school, and again, addressing her concerns about issues raised by mandatory vaccinations in the education sector. And finally, Steve Bush joining us. Steve is a Sydney-based former Qantas pilot of some 20 years, and more recently a transport driver who finds himself facing mandatory vaccination in his role. So a really fabulous group of people. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving up your Saturday morning like this. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. I'm going to pop over to John Ruddick now and do my best in moving the spotlight to him, and otherwise I'll drop to the background and see you all again for the Q&A.
Okay, well, terrific, Keith. Thanks very much for your help this week in organising this event, and thank you very much to our guests. We're very much looking forward to having a good, informative discussion here, and thank you for all the people that are joining us live. Just so people know, the Liberal Democratic Party is a pro-choice party when it comes to the COVID vaccine. Now, Labor, Liberal and the Greens are very much in favour of a mandatory vaccine. There are some parties out there which are anti-vaccine. Now, we are strictly a pro-choice party. We believe that individuals should consult their doctors, and there's a lot of information out there, and we strongly believe that a free society requires people to make their own personal choices. Now, we have been, myself and many other Liberal Democrats, have been inundated in an escalating way over the last few months, but particularly the last few weeks, with very, very concerned ordinary people who are writing to us and saying, John, what can I do? I am going to lose my job. Okay, I have decided I do not want to take the vaccine, and my employer is being very heavy-handed about this, and they're saying it's either the jab or it's the job. Now, quite a few other people have contacted us and said, I've quit my job. And they were in a financial position where they were able to do that. Maybe their spouse was working, maybe they were close to retirement anyway. But we are really concerned about people who, rightly or wrongly, have decided not to take the COVID vaccine and who simply do not have the option of quitting their job. They might have a young family, they might have a big mortgage, and these people are very, very scared. So today is really an information session. We've got some people who are really on top of all this. It's something that we hope that, people who are tuning in can learn something about their own situation. Now, the way I see it, across Australia right now, I've never seen anything like it in my 50 years. Families, friendships, workplaces are being torn apart because of this mandatory vaccine. And I want to say to the Liberal and Labor Party, my view is this is a price that is too high. Now, 100 years ago, even in places like Australia, we used to have smallpox outbreaks. Now, if somebody caught smallpox, there was a 30% chance they would die. So we're talking about a pretty serious disease, and it was particularly affecting younger people. Now, would we? And then there was a 100% perfect vaccine for smallpox. There was not a leaky vaccine. It was 100% effective, which is why there's no smallpox on the planet left now, which is a good thing. Now, but on the other hand, so look, I don't think people would have been really opposed to a compulsory vaccine when it came to smallpox. On the other hand, we've had the flu shots for the last few years. Nobody has ever talked about having the flu shots as a compulsory part of your work. So there must be somewhere between the flu shot, there's never been compulsion involved with that, and smallpox. There must be somewhere in the middle where we think, okay, well, at some point we would want to have a compulsory vaccine. I would say even if you had a disease that was killing 5 or 10% of people, you would say, okay, well, that's still a very, very serious vaccine. Now, the data on COVID, we've had it for about 18 months, definitely has a higher fatality rate than the regular flu, okay? But I think we need to have some proportionality here. Now, I hear, and hopefully this is something we can explore with our guests in a moment, I'm seeing on the internet that there are reports that there are these rapid tests that can tell people very quickly, and I think that in some places of the world, people who don't want to take the vaccine, they can take a test and very quickly it can tell us, do they have COVID? Now then obviously if they've got COVID, they'll be self-isolating at home. And I would think that is if somebody has decided that they do not want to take the vaccine, rightly or wrongly, surely the government can have some compassion. These people are very often frontline workers. Why can't we be moving towards that type of a regime? Now, I just wanted to, I wanted to bring in Rob McCauley in a moment to give us a legal overview of where the various court cases are up to on this question. Before I did, I wanted to quote from the Deputy President of the Fair Work Commission, Lyndall Dean, who earlier this week, there was a matter that was settled. Now Lyndall wrote a dissenting opinion. So that means that the other two people who gave this opinion did not agree with her. However, it's got a lot of publicity. She wrote very eloquently, very, very forcefully. And I just wanted to read out some of the key things that the Deputy President of the Fair Work Commission said this week. And here we go. The statements by politicians that those who are not vaccinated are a threat to public health and should be, quote, locked out of society and denied the ability to work are not measures to protect public health. They are not about public health and not justified because they do not address the actual risk of COVID. These measures can only be about punishing those who choose not to be vaccinated. And I agree, there is an element of punishing those who don't want to go along with the groupthink. This is not liberal. This is not what we do in a liberal society. And then she said, all Australians should vigorously oppose the introduction of a system of medical apartheid and segregation in Australia. It is an abhorrent concept and morally and ethically wrong, and the antithesis of our democratic way of life and everything we value. Australians should also vigorously oppose the ongoing censorship of any views that question the current policies regarding COVID-19. Science is no longer science if a person is not allowed to question it. Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, we have, many of you will have heard of John Larter, and we will get to John Larter shortly. Robert McCauley has been acting as his solicitor. And so, Rob, we would be keen for, there'll be a lot of people tuned in this morning who are legal laymen. They will have heard that there's various actions going on. We'd be grateful if you could just give us a key summary of what professions are most at stake, what deadlines have we got of when people have to take these vaccines, and tell us about the interesting legal cases that are going on around Australia that might be able to change the direction we're heading in.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Keith, for organising this. Good morning, folks. I'll just start with a case that John has just mentioned, and that is the case of Kimber, which was decided by the Fair Work Commission just this past Wednesday, a couple of days ago. For anybody who wants to look it up, it is called Jennifer Kimber versus Sapphire Coast Community Aged Care. And if you just no doubt Google Kimber and Sapphire Coast FWC, you'll find that case. The dissenting judgment, in other words, unfortunately, the losing judgment, is very well set out by Deputy President Dean, and should give everybody both an insight into what logical and rational judges and decision makers should think about these proceedings, and should give everyone really some scope for optimism to some degree that there are a number of judges around the place who do still think logically and rationally and liberally in the traditional sense of that word about these matters. But that case, and particularly her dissenting judgment, is well worth a read because it encapsulates really the broad liberal and again, in the traditional sense of that word, the natural justice issues that are at stake in these right across the country, but most particularly really in Victoria and New South Wales. Overnight, or yesterday, 24 hours ago, the Premier of Victoria announced mandatory vaccination regime for all authorised workers in Victoria. And so that is far in excess of the mandatory vaccination regime that is being imposed upon the good people of New South Wales. That
Rob,
encompasses...
What is the definition of an authorised employee?
Yes, so authorised employees are those people in Victoria at the moment who are allowed to leave their homes to work, and they include obviously the whole slew of health and aged care workers, but also retail workers, transport workers, everybody anywhere in the food and grocery production line, from agriculture through manufacturing and transport through to retail grocery store workers. So it really is a great number of people. A huge cross-section of the community is now subject to a mandatory vaccination order as of yesterday. Now, that is not something that has been brought in by their employers as a health and safety initiative. This is a blanket public health order, and at the same time, Mr. Andrews has brought in what really one could only consider the most draconian fines one has ever heard of. The fine increase yesterday for a breach of a public health order in Victoria yesterday became, believe it or not, hold your breath, for any breach of a public health order, including, all of those good freedom fighters who go out and have a little protest on the street. It's $10,904 now for getting caught in breach of a public health order in Victoria, effective immediately.
Rob, sorry, could I ask a question? That public health order about authorised employees, is that relying on the state of emergency under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, or is this going to be permanent?
No, I suppose it's a good question, but it relies on the current emergency regime, which gives rise to the authority to issue health orders. But when you ask if it's going to be permanent, of course, by the time somebody's double vaccinated, well, that's become permanent, hasn't it? Really?
Well, it has. But does that mean we end up with a permanent state of public health emergency if Big Dan wants to keep going with this?
Well, I think, David, it's a very good point, and I think it quite likely he has proven that he is well prepared to do whatever is necessary to enforce his particular bureaucratic and health views on the populace of Victoria. Don't mind, we're not too far behind in New South Wales. So in Victoria, as I say, this new public health order, mandatory vaccination order, is extraordinarily wide. In New South Wales, as John Larter has and many of his health colleagues have discovered, the mandatory vaccination order applies to anybody working in healthcare and anyone in aged care. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone. If you are an ancillary temporary worker, for instance, of a company that contracts to New South Wales Health, even if you're sitting in parks on a telephone giving telehealth advice, you are subject to a mandatory vaccination order. It does not matter what your circumstances are, and there is an extraordinarily narrow band for medical contraindication to escape it. They are not accepting any. I have not seen a single medical, from my experience, and I've seen hundreds of attempts, I have not seen a medical contraindication accepted thus far. And I can tell you from a practical point of view, doctors who are prepared to sign certificates certifying a medical contraindication are quickly finding themselves the subject, as John has been, of what I consider to be orchestrated campaigns of complaint to have them dragged before AHPRA, the Australian Health Practitioners Registration Authority, and be the subject of immediate and draconian disciplinary activity. And the AHPRA is using something called a Section 150 of the National Rules to determine in camera that something is so egregious or so desperately urgent that it needs to be heard immediately. And they will usually give somebody like John Larter, who had the temerity to speak about his views, they will give him 3 or 4 days, perhaps a week, to front up to a hearing where the AHPRA is prepared with a sheath of orchestrated complaints, and I don't say that lightly. I know they are orchestrated because they use the same language and contain the same phrases. They're not quite cut and paste jobs, but they're very close to it. And somebody like John Larter and many dozens, scores of other both health professionals and other types of practitioners within health are being used. This mechanism is being used against them, and then they are being suspended from practice. So if they can't get John Larter one way, they are determined to get him another way. And you are not reading about this in the newspaper, but I and John and many other people who are involved in getting all sorts of feedback from all sorts of health professionals can tell you that this is happening all over Australia and is receiving absolutely no press from the mainstream media. It is grotesquely unfair, and and really is illustrative of the core problem here. And I'll boil right down to it. Mhm.
I want to get to John later in a moment, but look, that was quite alarming what you were saying about this new Victorian order. So I'd be grateful if you could tell us what avenues are there for appealing this, and what are our chances? I mean, so far the courts have not been, they've been sort of pretty compliant with what the government wants. So what are the next steps that can be taken about it?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think there is a slight difference between Victoria and New South Wales, and that is in New South Wales, we have nothing that could be considered to be a bill or a charter of rights. There is really a vacuum, what lawyers would call a lacuna, which is literally a void of positive law in relation to all sorts of rights of freedom of association, for instance, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, personal integrity of the body, which is, of course, infringed upon by a mandate. Whereas in Victoria, John, there is a legislated, not constitutional, but merely legislated network or skeleton of rights that have not been heavily litigated. And so there are a number of cases in Victoria that are not as far as advanced as at least two cases in New South Wales that are trying to enforce rights of personal bodily integrity, and we'll see what happens with those. The two most advanced cases in New South Wales are cases that are right now before the New South Wales Supreme Court, and they are the cases of Kassam versus Hazard and the matter of Natasha Henry versus the Minister of Health, Mr. Hazard. They had their second day of hearing yesterday before the Chief Judge at Common Law, and they did not complete, so they've been stood over for further hearing on Tuesday. You can expect that those cases will be decided fairly rapidly. Particularly the case of Kassam is being advocated by a very well-regarded barrister by the name of Peter King, who is chasing down every borough, and it will be interesting to see what comes of that. You can expect, John, I think that a decision will be made fairly rapidly. But
what's the best case scenario with that Kassam case?
So the best case scenario is that the health order would be declared invalid, and that would have, of course, complete applicability to everybody affected by the health order. I don't want to speculate on the likelihood of that happening. I think that even if it did happen, I think we have a health minister and a minister for police in New South Wales who would move very quickly to come up with some other formulation of health order which tried to do the same thing, or to have the heads of the various organisations that comprise health, like New South Wales Ambulance, for instance, they would have them move rapidly to try and achieve the same aim via an internal employer's directive for health and safety reasons. And that is what they've done, John, in respect of professions that are outside health and aged care. We see those directives being made by the Department of Communities and Justice in relation to corrective service workers, in relation to youth justice workers. We see the same diktat being made by Commissioner Fuller in relation to all police in New South Wales, and that includes, when I say police, I mean all employees of the New South Wales Police Force. So again, not just frontline officers, that is every single person. There's 17,000 sworn police officers in New South Wales, but there's another 9,000 employees of the New South Wales Police Force on top of that who are in various administrative and other positions, and they are all affected. Now, those people are also fighting. So you've got a number of people from health who are fighting in the New South Wales Supreme Court who are fighting a public health order on the basis of reasonableness and a few other things.
What's the name of that case, so we can keep an eye out for that one?
So, well, Kassam and Henry are versus Hazard are the two cases that are right now being heard.
Okay,
Lata is coming up for hearing on the 3rd of November. It will commence. There's another one called Ibrahim in the state of New South Wales, which is also which is up for hearing on the 19th of October, and that matter also contests the public health order. Now, as of yesterday afternoon, my firm commenced proceedings for a representative sample of New South Wales police officers. We've commenced for one police officer in particular, but standing behind him are several hundred sworn serving New South Wales police officers who are subject to a mandate, and many more, I suspect, will be added to them. Now, they are different proceedings, and they've been commenced in the New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission, which is the relevant jurisdiction for those. So there's lots of litigation running around the place. There's a sprinkling of similar things in Queensland. I think one of the most interesting angles will be an argument that arises from a now 26-year-old case called Teo, a High Court case that determined, as a backstop to everything else, it determined that where there was a reasonable apprehension in the community that Australia has civil rights obligations pursuant to an international covenant that we have entered into, then even if the government thinks it's not applicable in Australia, it is. And that TO and a case following it called Lamb have not been litigated for a long time in Australia, but as a backstop to everything else, there's all sorts of constitutional and international rights lawyers who would tell you that that we have arguably, given that Australia signed on to the United Nations Charter on Civil and Political Rights 41 years ago in 1980, and Article 18 of that charter protects both your religious and political rights. The government, both the Commonwealth government and various other governments around Australia, will tell you that even though we signed that charter, that international covenant, they say that you can't use it against them and it's not enforceable in Australia. They say it's not domesticated. And we will litigate that. TO is not being litigated currently in any of the matters, and we will be litigating that in the later proceedings in the New South Wales Supreme Court. And obviously, if it's unsuccessful there, then it can go on both to the higher courts in Australia and ultimately to courts of wider jurisdiction abroad, international courts.
Robert, look, thank you so much for everything you're doing, and thank you very much for being along here today. Because I mean, you are. You're
very welcome.
We should nominate you for Australian of the Year, because that's what you're doing is, often I'm sure it's thankless, but it's so important. So we're very grateful. Look, it's a good opportunity now to bring in John Lata, who probably more than anybody else has been the public face of this campaign. I have known John for a few years, not that well, but I've always known he does good things and he fights for good causes. So, John, let's assume that the people listening in don't know anything about you. Tell us a little bit about what your job is. You're on the local council down there as well, and then tell us what's recently happened with your employment.
Thanks, John, and thanks to Keith, and thanks for Rob's input there. He's been absolutely invaluable, and I think that just demonstrated just how serious we are about this, just to
give some oversight and, the professional people that we've got involved. So I'm really proud of what they're doing at PTW. It's fantastic. Look, just to give you some overview, look, I've been a paramedic for 25 plus years. I've worked in all areas of New South Wales air ambulance, on the road in Sydney, in places like Mascot and Marrickville, Campsie, Green Valley, Bankstown. I've also worked in the media department of the ambulance and also in the control centres. Moved to Tumut in 2006 and started as the manager in Tumut, and I've been there ever since. Married with six children, 5 girls and 1 boy. My wife's a registered nurse, and she's got a significant history working in emergency departments throughout Australia, and she's got a master's degree in clinical teaching as well. And look, I am politically involved. I've been a member of the Liberal Party for nearly 20 years, and I've previously run as a candidate in Wollongong in the seat of Cunningham at a federal election in 2004. When John Howard was the Prime Minister, it was a great honour to do that. And I've sought pre-selection a couple of times after in state seats as well, when Darryl Maguire left. And yeah, look, I've served on the local council. I've been the deputy mayor for 7 years and also the mayor as well. I don't see that so much as a political appointment. It's more of a community service to me. I really enjoy getting amongst the community, and I obviously have a great involvement with our community and do stuff with people like the SES and helping the RFS and all those organisations. So look, I've got a background in aviation as well. I've got a commercial helicopter licence and also a private fixed wing licence, and I like to get out and fly. And I've got an ex-military plane. So yeah, that's sort of where I am. I suppose we're busy with 6 kids, and look, I just felt that somebody needed to speak up about what's happening with where we're going today.
Your employer told you, which I'm guessing is the New South Wales Ambulance Service or something, they told you how long ago that you couldn't continue your job unless you took the COVID vaccine. Is that what happened?
Well, essentially, we really haven't had any advice from New South Wales Ambulance, and I think you'll find that this is the case across the majority of health, that there's been varying and differing information come from various HR departments. So I think, to be fair, I think those poor people have been at 6s and 7s with regard to where we're at. I get the impression the Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, made this decision on the run, and I don't think from what I understand that it was fully supported, but he went ahead and did it anyway, and it's just been a calamity ever since. It's just been essentially policy on the run from Hazzard, and the ambulance service I think has just been at a loss to know what to do with it. I mean, majority of people haven't even received instructions or letters. They don't know what's going on. They don't know whether they're on leave without pay or officially. I mean, I had a situation this morning where a guy even turned up to work and rang me at 8 o'clock, and there was
John. Okay, John's connection. We might come back to John. Okay, well, I think it might be interesting to hear from Angela Keptus. Is John back with us? Can you hear me, Angela?
I can hear you, and just jump in, John. John, we lost you for a minute.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Looks like you're back in business, John. So sorry, mate. We lost you about a minute ago.
Oh, sorry about that. So look, essentially, the ambulance service, I think, is just at 6s and 7s, as is every other health department in relation to working this out with the staff. I don't think anyone really knows, from a HR perspective, whether they're on leave without pay, whether they've got a job, whether they've been terminated. There's just great confusion out there.
So how many of your colleagues do you think are in a similar situation where they would prefer not to take the mandatory vaccine?
Well, I think it's in excess of 300.
Okay, and you with the help of Robert McCauley, you've gone to the court, the Supreme Court, and where's that up to, and what precisely is the point that we're arguing?
Well, look, essentially, I think the point is that there's obviously a number of law cases before the Supreme Court, but look, everyone's situation is different. But look, in relation to my case, I think Rob probably explained that better than I could. But the reality is, it's about having a choice. It's about being pro-choice. Nobody should be forced to undertake a medical procedure without informed consent. And the bedrock principle of healthcare since I've been involved with it has been first do no harm and informed consent. I can't accept the vaccine. I don't know enough about it. I don't know the origins of it. It's not been explained. They want to censor everyone who has an opinion on it that differs from the government, and that's been very clear from APRA. And there is no safety data on any of the material that's being used, the long-term effects of it. So, look, there are a number of reasons, and Rob obviously pointed out there's also a religious and political view of it as well. For a lot of people, and obviously I'm getting a lot of emails and people are ringing me that they've got various objections to having it. But look, the reality is from our workplace, and I think this is the significant thing, there is no evidence to suggest that if you're unvaccinated in the workplace, even in healthcare, that you're more likely to transmit this virus to somebody. The reality is the better control measure, and I think this was very succinctly pointed out by the Fair Work Commission, that the best control measure is to do a rapid antigen test in the morning before you start the shift, because if you do that, you don't have it. And therefore you can go about your activity and be confident that you're not going to pass on that virus because you don't have it with the appropriate protective clothing. So, I think... What
do you think with this rapid antigen test, which I do keep hearing about, but I don't know that much about it. Let's say you take it at 7 o'clock in the morning. At what point do you actually get a positive or a negative result?
I think it's within 10 minutes.
Okay. So, that should solve everything.
John, I can answer that. I've just assisted a substantial organisation introduce rapid antigen testing in New South Wales. Okay. And in just the time that it's taken, the 1 month required to introduce it, the time to receive your entirely accurate result has gone down from 5 minutes to less than 1 minute. So people can be tested at the door, and it is absolutely determinative within 1 minute. Interestingly enough, abroad, for instance, in Germany, you can go to Aldi and you can buy rapid antigen tests straight off the shelf. They don't require a medical professional to administer them. They can be self-administered and give you a result within 1 minute.
Okay, so is it up your nose or on your tongue, or is it?
No, it's a saliva test.
Okay,
saliva test is
that's easy.
Just a swab.
Mm-hmm. And is it? I mean, some people might say it's going to be too expensive. It's probably less expensive than the vaccine. But I mean, if you can buy it out, I'm guessing it's not that expensive. But what's your understanding?
So right now in Australia, they're about, if you are buying a lot of them in bulk, you can get them for about $15 each. But even that price has been slashed dramatically. A month ago, they cost $50. Now they cost $15. I strongly suspect within weeks they will cost a handful of dollars each, and they are entirely determinative. And the interesting thing, of course, John, is that we keep hearing these governments go on about home quarantine and quarantine returning to Australia. But of course, why would you lock somebody up if you can know within 1 minute whether they're positive or negative? I mean, it makes no logical sense whatsoever. It is entirely irrational.
Sounds like the answer to me. Okay, so look, thanks very much for that. That was very interesting. Okay, so Angela, let's hear from you. You're a school safety specialist, and so tell us a little bit about your professional background and what you're doing now. And you were at a march yesterday, which is that right? That's right. Okay, so what Reclaim the Line. So tell us a little bit about that protest as well.
Sure. How about I tell you a bit about myself?
Yep.
If I might need your help asking me questions to go where you want me to go, because I have no experience being in something like this.
No problem at all.
I just want to shout out to my best friend who put me up for it. She's also the one who got me to go on Perfect Match when I was 18 years old. So, so I work in the education sector. I've worked in the education sector for 10 years, and my role predominantly is I'm in an independent school, and I support the school with WHS, so that's work health and safety. So almost on a daily basis, ordinarily pre-COVID, I would be writing risk management plans, and that would be, for day trips and camps and, any sort of activity that we do with the children. I'm also trained as a child protection investigator, and I train all our staff annually on child protection, and any new staff coming to the school receive an induction from me in all aspects of school safety and child protection. Prior to being in the education sector, I was a barrister for 4 years, and so human rights was my thing. I represented the Falun Gong in the Supreme Court, and I also acted on behalf of the Environmental Defenders Office, standing up for protesters and getting their fines and criminal charges dismissed. While I was studying law, I was a judge's associate for 10 years, and that was the district court, and I was associate to a very conservative judge, and I mentioned this for a reason, by the way, because he called me the nicest lefty he ever met. I have a point for that. And then prior to working in the courts, I was a registered nurse, and I was an operating theatre nurse. So I have 2 degrees, one to be a nurse, a registered nurse, and the other one was with law. The reason I mention being the nicest lefty a conservative judge has ever met is because I'm really concerned by the media narrative and people, the way people have portrayed, because they have questions. So John, I can see from the comments coming through that, I'm a person just like you, but I have questions. But what the media is doing to people like us who ask questions, and like John, he has questions about safety, they're being portrayed in the media as right-wing fascists. So that's why I just want to point out to you that for 10 years I was called the nicest lefty. So I am definitely not a right-wing fascist. Then the media, I heard the head of the CMFEU regarding the protests in Victoria. His own people, he called them uneducated idiots. And that really gets my goat. So, because I know the people in the chat here, they're medical professionals, they're teachers, they're coming from all sorts of backgrounds. I've got 2 degrees. That's like waving a red flag at me. Why are you being so insulting to these people just because they have questions?
Look, that's all a fascinating background, and I think we all enjoyed that. Now, but what is actually happening with the schools that you're in contact with? Have the teachers been told that they should get a vax, or that they must get a vax? And if they must get a vax, do they, and they won't, are they being resignations happening? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so we, like the healthcare sector, it's not just the teachers, it's anyone who works in the education sector. So you could be a contractor, admin staff, groundsperson, regardless of your role, everyone in the education sector, same as in health, has been given a deadline of the 8th of November to receive both vaccines. But it might be that you can come back if you've had one and you can show that you've got an appointment for the next one. I'm actually not, yeah, maybe you have to work from home, I'm not sure. But yeah, the deadline is the 8th of November.
That is for New South Wales schools or for Australia-wide?
New South Wales.
Right.
And so the concern now for the education sector is that in the independent sector, I can tell you that some schools are going to lose 50% of their staff.
Sure.
Some schools will have to close. There's been surveys of the public sector which indicates that they will lose 10% of their staff. And the comment I'd like to make about that is, I know anecdotally in the public sector that not everyone is answering those surveys because they're nervous, even though they say they're anonymous. Education staff have been nervous to answer the surveys because they think that there'll be some negative action taken against them if they indicate that they will not choose to get vaccinated. So that 10% figure could be higher. But even if it's lower, the education sector is already short-staffed. So who's going to replace all these staff? And particularly in the independent sector, what I can tell you is that class sizes will have to increase. Students will be, so parents who are losing choice in the, so parents who want to choose an independent school for their children, their choices are going to be limited because without the staff to provide the classes, enrolments are going to be turned away and class sizes will increase. In our school, where we provide extra learning support in the classroom, say for example an English or a maths lesson where students need additional learning support, we don't put in a classroom assistant with a TAFE certificate. We put in another teacher. So in our school, where learning support is required, we put 2 teachers in the classroom. So that will go. So where parents choose the independent sector because they want smaller classes and and that additional learning support, there won't be the staff for that. And also they'll be turning enrolments away. This will put added pressure on the already burgeoning pressure on the public school system. So in the public school system, you'll see, again, class sizes are going to increase and there'll be less ability to provide that extra learning support at both ends of the spectrum. So students at either end of the spectrum deserve additional learning support. And I just can't see where that's going to come from. Where are you going to get the staff to replace those? And I think
that the international evidence is quite clear that schoolrooms do not pose much of a COVID threat. So this is just another form of being mean to people, that are vulnerable. So Angela, or maybe Robert might be able to help this. Are there legal, so you're saying the 8th of November, which is not far away, it's about 5-6 weeks away. If you're a teacher and for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, you do not want to take your 2 COVID vaccines, you will be stood down or at least put leave without pay or something. Are there people challenging this legally? Where are we up to with that?
I can answer that, John. There are about, as I understand it, at the moment, there are about 11,000 people in the New South Wales education system who have not been vaccinated and who are, you might say, are starting to become the sort of core of people who actually will not be vaccinated, who will refuse, who are prepared to stand the line.
A lot of people, 11,000.
And yes, and they are organising. The problem for a lot of these people, and John and I'm sure Steve would have discovered this, is there are a lot of people who are not in the loop, who are not connected with others, and I keep getting phone calls from people who think they're alone or there's only a couple of them, but there are hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands, and the bigger the organisation is, of course, the more. Of the 17,000 police officers, for instance, there are at least 1,000 who will refuse to be vaccinated. Of teachers, that 11,000 range, which is about 8% of the workforce, we're talking a lot of people. Angela is quite right that if people hold the line, if people are not coerced, and I can tell you that every day there are more and more people falling over and saying, well, bugger it, I've got to pay the mortgage, I'll just go and get the jab, doing it against their will. The numbers of people prepared to hold the line are getting smaller as the price of doing so increases. But there are a lot of people, Angela, I totally agree.
So Angela, just tell us about hashtag reclaim the line. So for people that aren't familiar with it, so just hold that up again. Okay, so hashtag reclaim the line. So tell me what's that about?
So within a few days of the mandate being announced for the education sector, the mandate was announced on the 27th of August, a Telegram group started, which is currently called, I think it's Australian Educators United. It's got those 3 words in it. I might have got the order mixed up. And now there are currently more than 20,000 people in that group. Obviously, not all 20,000 of them are employees of the education. Many of them are parents who support employees in the education system who are pro-choice. And so that group has been, you've probably received our letters, John. We've been actively writing to members of parliament. There's a change.org protest, which is protesting mandatory vaccinations for education staff and students. And yesterday was the first rally, and it was a nationwide rally. And we've joined with other sectors. So it wasn't just the education sector. Yesterday, that rally was joined by tradies, health, government workers, police, and probably others, if anyone wants to help me to fill in the gaps on that. But yeah, so just any industry where there's a mandate looming or already in place, that was what the protests were about yesterday. And they were huge, but they didn't get airtime. I was interviewed by someone from the Telegraph, and nothing I said made it into that report. So it's really concerning to me that ordinary Australians don't know that this is going on, don't know that that this is the impact it's going to have for their children's education, their grandchildren. You know, everyone's got a child or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew. And why isn't this in the media? Why isn't this being talked about? And the other point I wanted to make is, where is the due process? So these decisions have been made, and there's been no opportunity for the schools to even put their position forward and say, this is what you're doing to our school. Our school's going to have to close, or we don't know how we're going to function because we're only going to have 50% of our teachers. So for such an unusual and extreme measure, there's got to be due process. Where's the parliamentary debate for this? If there was parliamentary debate, you would be hearing from people from all these fields, from experts. They'll be talking about the safety concerns that John's got, the impact that such a mandate's going to have on the education system. And like you said, what is the real risk to children? So the World Health data, John Ioannidis, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So he's posted the mortality rate in January. So this is up on the World Health Organization database, and you might think, well, January was 10 months ago. There is a preprint of his latest data. I think it's just waiting for peer review to go up, but the data, the numbers aren't changing. Statistically, children are at statistically zero risk of dying from COVID. That doesn't mean a child hasn't died, but in statistical statistically, a child is at a zero risk of dying from COVID. At our school, we've got our own buses, and we're really into outdoor education. So we get our kids and we put them in a bus on the road. There's at least one of our buses out every day pre-COVID. And if there's a camp on the same week, then we've got 2 buses on the road, bus full of kids. And I guarantee you that, you know, touch wood, the risk for us, that's our biggest risk as a school, that one of those buses will have an accident and there'll be very serious consequences. And yet parents are more than willing to send their children to our school, you know, and accept that risk, which is, you know, I can't put a number on it, but we all know that motor vehicle accidents are big. And every day, parents send their children to our school, we put them in a bus and they're willing to take that risk. And yet COVID has a, you know, like a zero risk. The other big risk is swimming. So children have died in Australia at swimming carnivals. Huge. That's awful. And I don't ever want that to happen. And I certainly don't want it to happen at the school. So, but we risk manage that and we still do it despite the risk. Child protection is also a really big risk.
Angela, thank you for what you're doing. It takes courage, and we're really grateful that some people are stepping up. And I agree with your former boss that you're one of the nicest lefties that I've met. So keep going. And if people want to know more, they can. You're saying the Telegram account is the one to follow, is that right?
Yeah, or go to Instagram. So if you go to Instagram and look for hashtag Reclaim the Line, then you'll find the group for your industry, because Reclaim the Line is across industries, not just education. So there's a group for health, there's Healthcare Workers United, Education United. Yeah, get onto Telegram and
okay, fabulous. Now, I want to bring in another very interesting person, Jack Maguire here, who prior to yesterday I hadn't really heard of, but then the Sydney Morning Herald had a lengthy story on what he's doing. It sounded very good to me. I think it was meant to be a bit of a hit job on him. So from what I can see, Jack, and look, I have never really paid too much attention to industrial relations matters, but you're right in the thick of it. And I understand 6 years ago, you started what we could sort of call in layman's language, low cost, non-politically affiliated unions. So you fight for your members, but it costs less for your members to join, and money doesn't go to a political party. It's not run by people who are using unions as a stepping stone into parliament, which might have happened with one of our Australian political parties. And because you're sort of a truly member-based group of unions across a number of industries, people have come to you and said, hey, look, fight for us. We want to have some choice on the vaccine. Have I described you accurately?
I could not have said that better myself. I'll have to pay you later, John. Thanks very much. But no, that's exactly right. We got a bit of a toweling in the Sydney Morning Herald for taking the unpopular opinion, a very controversial opinion, that if a member pays us dues, we should support them. The other unions seem to be deserting their members who have very real workplace health and safety concerns. They feel like this vaccine's rolled out much too quickly, and the necessary legislative consultation steps haven't been done. But yes, just back on our unions. So we set up about 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, maybe perhaps now, the Nurses Professional Association of Queensland. There was a payroll bungle in Queensland where it meant, somewhere up to 600 nurses weren't paid for over 2 years. And they, at the time, the union was affiliated with the Labor Party. I think the union did then remove its affiliation, but those people, there was a number of nurses who felt they didn't go hard enough and were quite silent. So they sort of came across, wanted to set up a new union. We thought, yep, okay, this is a great idea. We baked into the constitutions the prohibition to support either, in-kind support or political donations to any political party. We have a flat rate structure. It's about $442 per annum. Other unions can scale up to, $1,000 a year based on your income. We just charge what it costs to provide that service, which is, funny Sally was saying, you know, we're ripping people off, or we're ripping people off by charging half as much, or we're just in it to make a buck or something. After we set up the Nurse Professional Association Queensland, that went for about 4 or 5 years. And then a couple of years ago, a group of teachers came to us and said, we really liked what you've done with the nurses. Can you help us form a union for teachers? Sure, we'll do that. TPAQ was formed, and it was to rival both the Independent Education Union and the Queensland Teachers Union. Then there was a group of bus drivers. They formed a little group of their own, 35, and then they came to us and said, geez, it's really hard to started to administer these and fight these fights. How do you keep a union up and running? So they joined our umbrella. We then had the pandemic. There's a group of doctors came to us and said they're sick of being silenced and gagged. They wanted to see the restoration of the primacy of the doctor-patient relationship, and you know, stop governments telling them what they can do, and stop governments. I mean, they're not there to do harm. They swear the Hippocratic Oath, right? So we're trying to we've corralled the group of doctors together, and they're trying to get well, some of the medical evidence even for our matters that we're taking to trial, but even still, they would like to have APRA seriously removed from their back. We have then gone on to move our NPAQ and TPAQ national, because we were being inundated with requests from Victoria and New South Wales from teachers and nurses saying, what can we do? And I think that we can help them. I must say the Australian Medical Professional Society was the union formed for doctors to rival the AMA. They also didn't believe in this blanket vaccination stuff that the AMA has been talking about. They believe in a individualized approach, as all medicine should be. That's just my opinion. And then only just over the weekend, we've set up the Sworn Officers Professional Association of Australia out of a need of police officers who really wanted something done. Sort of originated out of Victoria, actually, a group of very decent people down there. And then up in Queensland, it's sort of been in our pipeline for a little while, and it came out that the police union not only backed the commissioner in the mandate, they went a step further and said that they would legally back any vaccinated officer that didn't want to work with an unvaccinated officer. So just incredibly divisive stuff from that union, and all of these unions around the country have totally left this field, right? So we're now getting inundated with a lot of Victorians as well in all sorts of industries, aviation, and some even in construction. So our next move may be to set up a miscellaneous workers union to try and help them out, but it's been a crazy couple of weeks. So usually, John, we grow at sort of maybe 15 members a day. We have been growing, I think, at about 250 members a day on average now. So we've grown from 8,000 members to almost 11,000 members in a very short space of time. So our office here has been staffed with a huge amount of volunteer nurses to try and help us with the demand. We've got I think we've doubled our staff out on the floor. So it's, it feels like a big responsibility. We're trying to help as many people as we can, and I think we really can help people organise and give them not only advice, but then take their issues on in relation to workplace health and safety concerns.
What industry do you find has the highest percentage of people who, for whatever reason, do have vaccine hesitancy?
I would say it's our nurses. We did a survey, I'll just bring it up here, of 2,200 nurses. Most of those were NPAQ members. And in that survey, it came back that, well, it says now that 63% have not had their COVID jab. Now, I don't think that carries across the whole industry, but that figure alone of, I think it's about 1,400 nurses have not been vaccinated. And that's just a very small grouping. And even if it's only 1,400 of NPAQ members, we make up 10% of the workforce. So no doubt there would be quite a significant number of nurses across the sector. And then interestingly enough too, out of the 1,400 respondents to this question, have you been coerced into getting the jab? 623 or 43% said they had been coerced. So
Wow.
I guess nurses are in a similar position to a lot of other people, where there's this, continuing spectrum of people that sort of felt uncomfortable with it, but when the employer says to go do it, okay, well, I'll go do it. To those people that just don't want to go and do it at all.
Well,
And then there's a vast majority of our members who just want to have a risk assessment done and have a conversation with their employer about it, so that they can potentially have their concerns allayed.
Look, it is extraordinary, and it should be a lot more newsworthy than it is. But all around the world, there seems to be nurses, the people who last year we were saying were the heroes, who were working very long hours and saving people in the COVID wards. For some reason, these people are the most reluctant to take it as a profession. And I wish some of our mainstream journalists would look into this and rather than demonize these people, maybe these people have got an interesting angle that we should be considering. So, Jack, if people are interested to learn more about what your unions can do, how do they get in contact with you?
There's a landing page, www.redunion.com.au, and it's got a list of all of our unions up there. On each of our unions pages, there's a workplace health and safety concern. You click on that, it'll take you through. There's a couple of stages there that we're giving to people because it helps protect their interests. So, if they've taken an active step to exercise a workplace right, which is to inquire about workplace health and safety, then that sort of protects their position. It gives them a little bit more wiggle room down the track if things do turn sour.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for coming on today. Very interesting. Okay, now we've got
Thanks,
two
John.
more speakers, and then we'll hand over to the Q&A. I wanted to end with David Porter, who wrote a very interesting article in the Spectator yesterday. So we'll come back to it in a moment, David. But we've got Steve Bush with us. Steve was a Qantas pilot for 20 years, and I understand you're now driving a bus, Steve. So walk us through what that transition and why it happened.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I think Bob Hawke said some years ago that during the airline strike that the airline pilots were glorified bus drivers. Well, here I am now driving a bus. So anyway, so I work in a large bus industry in north of Sydney in Ryde, and I have been enjoying that job for a bit of a while now. But what has happened is the noose has gradually been brought around the workers' necks, and it originally started with a suggestion that people go and take their vaccination as a friendly sort of gesture. Then it came down to people who were in the LGA areas. They were told that by a certain date they had to have at least one vaccination, show proof of that. And then it came down to, they said that if this wasn't provided by a certain date, this was just a couple of weeks ago, that those people would then be forced to take their leave pay, their long service leave, etc., and then finally unpaid leave. And so it was isolating groups within the community. And I wrote back to my particular manager and said that I would not give them permission to touch my leave. I was fit and healthy to work, and but I think it's probably only a matter of time before that happens. Now, in the interim, it's interesting that you were talking about the rapid antigen testing, because I did speak to my direct manager and said to him that I'd be happy to liaise a test, that I would be happy to liaise for him a meeting with companies that provided the rapid antigen testing. And his answer to me was that the agenda was not about rapid antigen testing, but to get the vaccinations in place. And my answer to that was that the vaccinations aren't showing proof that they stop the infection rate, and they don't make the workplace a safe area, whereas rapid antigen testing does, because it tests a person to see whether they are contagious. It's a very rapid test, and it keeps the work environment safe. But that was the answer. So
they've got no interest in that being a solution. This is your HR person. Is that what we're saying?
No, it wasn't the HR person. It was the manager. Now, I will have to say that since then, I believe that there is some antigen testing that has come about. Maybe some pressure has come about through different sources, but I believe that they are they are now administering the antigen testing in some cases, but that was the answer that was given to me a couple of weeks ago, that they weren't interested in pursuing that route because the directive that had come from above was that they wanted people to be double vaccinated.
Right. Okay.
So the noose is closing, and what is happening is that unfortunately there are work colleagues of mine that have do not want to participate in this clot shot, this experimental trial that is being foisted onto the Australian public and indeed the world. And they've had to succumb. A lot of those people have had to succumb, as we've mentioned in the previous discussions, that they have families to feed. They've been given an ultimatum, and against their will, through the huge coercion of their livelihoods, have had to now stand against their choice and do what was asked of them. So the other thing that I'd speak with Angela, I echo that the comment that she made, that with the surveys that have been done and within Australia, our own Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that within our own community, it's there for everybody to see, is that there's a zero statistical chance of a child from 0 to 20 succumbing to this disease. And furthermore, the other interesting things that you can see with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, typically every year we've had 1,250 flu deaths, and now they've disappeared. As of July 2020, we have no registered flu deaths. So what's going on?
Well, it's extraordinary, isn't it? It's extraordinary that we keep being told that COVID is nothing to do with the flu. It's not related to the flu. And it's just a coincidence that as soon as the COVID came along, the flu, which has been around since we were cavemen or much earlier, has simply disappeared. Okay, Steve. Well, look, thank you for that. That is.
Could I just make one other point? As a former airline pilot, what we would do, we would look at the people that had gone before us and looked at weaknesses in the systems where accidents had happened and safety was compromised. And we would address those issues and we would administer that into our own safety operation standards. And what on earth is happening in Australia, where the countries that have gone before us that are well advanced in this vaccination process, and the carnage and the problems that are being caused around the world, our so-called experts aren't referring to any of that information. It just seems that they seem hell-bent on just one solution to the problem.
How do the Australian airlines compare with international responses from big airlines to COVID? Are we similar to them, or are we taking it further than them?
Look, it's interesting. There are some within Australia. I believe that the company that I was involved in is mandating, and the director of that airline said that right in the beginning, Alan Joyce, he said, we will be producing a situation where you have to be vaccinated to fly. And so the staff are now being coerced into having to take the vaccination. But I hear unconfirmed reports that I've from overseas, where they say that, for instance, in British Airways, they want an unvaccinated pilot to fly with a vaccinated pilot because of the accidents that have been happening. And of course, the cockpits are closed off from the cabin now. And so if you have a horrible situation where maybe the pilot's health is affected, then there's no way of getting that access into the cabin. And so they are wanting also to have that safety buffer, is what I've read and is unconfirmed, that they need an unvaccinated flying with a vaccinated.
Interesting. Okay, well, now we've got our wanted to leave David Porter to the end. David Porter has written a terrific article in what I believe is the best media outlet in the country, The Spectator Australia. It does not cost much to subscribe to. Every day, The Spectator has quality article after quality article, particularly during this COVID episode. The Spectator has really overperformed. Now, David has written an article which is in line with what I was just saying, a really quality article where you will get intelligent information that you will not have heard elsewhere. So as I understand it, David, you were a lawyer, you're now a farmer, a happily semi-retired farmer, but you have written an article saying that a law was passed in Australia in the early 1990s, the Disability Discrimination Act. It was really focused on protecting people from discrimination who were HIV positive. And you're saying that with the protections of that act, which are still on the books, can also protect people who are choosing not to take the COVID vaccine. Have I summarised it accurately?
Yes, you have. I think the position's clearly arguable. I have to say up front, I'm a bit of a one-trick pony compared to everybody else who seems to have put in a huge amount of work, especially Rob with his multiple litigation on many fronts. I just had a simple idea. I thought I'd get the biggest spanner I could and throw it right in the middle of the gearbox and see what happens. I never did disability law. I did corporate insolvency, so I just picked up the act. The reason it occurred to me, though, was because of a little girl named Eve Van Grafhorst. She was born in 1982, and she got a blood transfusion just after she was born, and she acquired AIDS that way. So in the mid-'80s on the Central Coast, where the whole Van Grafhorst thing unfolded, I grew up on the Central Coast of New South Wales, so I remember it very well, and it was a very hot topic of conversation. I remember my parents and their friends talking about it in the street. That was back in the days you were allowed to talk in the street. I remember talking about it at school with my friends. And it all really erupted when Eve Van Grafhorst bit another child at daycare. Toddlers do that. And this was, the mid-'80s, and everybody was still a bit worried that HIV could be spread via saliva. So Eve Van Grafhorst was told, you can't come to daycare unless you wear a muzzle. Now, in the end, the family was driven out of our community. They moved to New Zealand. It was a really shameful episode. So I thought, I'll just get out the act and read it and see what it says. And it's, and Rob might be able to step in here. And I know it's come up in the Kimber matter, because I was lucky to get mentioned at footnote 36 from the dissenting opinion in Kimber. I don't know if any of the other litigation has brought up the Disability Discrimination Act, Rob.
I think you're on mute, Rob.
David, it has not. None of the stuff that I'm aware of, no.
Okay. So, I mean, that idea popped into my head, and I don't know any disability discrimination. I just read the Act. But the High Court just keeps telling us, if you want to understand the intention of the Parliament, start with the text of the Act. Now, I won't bother taking you all through it. You can, if you really want to read the article, some things are just best done in writing. But the Act covers organisms that are capable of causing illness and disease. And that was clearly HIV back in 1992. That was squarely in everybody's mind. But it's not limited just to HIV. It covers not even just viruses, bacteria, prions and fungi. They're all organisms that are capable of causing illness and disease. And then the definition of disability is extended to past disability, present disability, possible future disability, and imputed disability. So it's intended to capture a very wide category of people. And it's odd to say, but when you're dealing with a contagious disease, we all have a disability, because we all, influenza, we've all either had it, have it right now, or we'll possibly have it in the future. So we all have the disability, and that engages the Act. So the next thing you've got to ask yourself is, well, how do we deal with public health? Because there was a very significant public health response to HIV in Australia, and very effective, despite how limited it was. We didn't have any lockdowns for HIV, which was the last time we had a novel virus introduced into Australia. And you've got to remember, it was a death sentence back in the day. We're very lucky now that we have antiretroviral drugs, but that didn't exist in the early 80s. So there were public health responses. They are allowed under the Disability Discrimination Act, but you're still asked, you've got to read the section. And this is what it ultimately comes down to is, does Section 48 operate? Now, Section 48 is a section that says if a person has a disability that is an infectious disease, then some reasonably necessary discriminations are allowed. And my first thought was, well, being unvaccinated isn't an infectious disease. It's just being unvaccinated. So saying that a person unvaccinated against any virus may have that virus is the same non sequitur as saying a gay man may have AIDS. It just doesn't follow. So I just don't see how Section 48, I don't see how the exemption ever operates. But I might be wrong, and not everyone agrees with me. There is one case on point. It's a 1996 decision of the Human Rights Commission, BG Amurshi Shire Council, if you really want to look it up. And that case held, it's not really a case, it's an opinion by the Commission. That opinion held that it was possible for the council to exclude 2 children who are unvaccinated against measles from a council daycare. Now, I won't bore you with legal argument. I reckon it's just straight up wrong, but it doesn't really matter for today's purposes, because either I'm right, in which case there's essentially a blanket ban on vaccination passports. Like, you just pretty much can't do it. Vaccinate, you can call it a vaccine mandate or whatever you want to describe it as. There's essentially a blanket ban on it, if I'm right. If I'm wrong, then you have to have a look at what is reasonably necessary, which is a vast legal exercise. Because at the moment, apart from the Act, there is strictly no law on this. There's that authority from 1996, the Beattie case, but it's not really law. It's an opinion of the Commission. The only real law is the Act itself. And it says the disability has to be an infectious disease before you get into the public health exemption. The real problem, though, is not whether I'm right or wrong, it's the uncertainty. Because there's millions of businesses out there now who are having to make decisions. And if it turns out that I am right, it has happened in the past. If it turns out that I am right, then they're all going to be breaching the Act. They're all going to be open to damages claims. And it's intolerable that our politicians have left the whole country in this position, that nobody really knows what they're allowed to do under the law. And it would be very easy for the Commonwealth to fix it. They just need to pass some legislation. But my point in all of this is, well, if they're going to pass some legislation, we are a democracy. Shouldn't we have a public debate? Shouldn't there be a Senate inquiry? Shouldn't we have draft legislation? Because that's how it's always been done in the past. But instead, we have each of the states and territories ramming through individual vaccine mandate schemes on the basis of, as I understand things, emergency powers in Victoria. No one's really stopped to think about the bigger picture here. And that's why I decided to get off my tractor and write an article for The Spectator.
Well, David, how could we get the courts to test your thesis about the Discrimination Act?
Well, I have to say, things turned out better than I expected. Like I said, my plan was just to throw to throw a spanner into the gearbox. And Deputy President Dean of the Fair Work Commission quoted me. Now, I might be wrong, but that has happened too. But my point is, there's almost no law on this issue, and it's really significant for the whole country. And it's certainly engaged in Kimber. And I have read news articles that Kimber is going to be appealed to the federal court. And so because it's in the dissenting opinion in Kimber, it will have to be addressed by a federal court judge. So hopefully we'll get an answer on it sooner rather than later, but we really needed an answer 6 months ago.
Okay. Well, look, that's terrific. So people that are interested in that article, you go to my Twitter feed at johnruddick2. Just at johnruddick2, and I've posted David Porter's article just up there now. It's definitely worth a read. Okay, well, Keith, we told our guests and our viewers that this would be 1.5 hours, and we've just completed 1.5 hours. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. but we haven't had any time for Q&A. So maybe we could have you got your eye on a couple of key questions? We don't want to delay our guests longer because they're busy fighting this good fight. But what do you propose we do from here?
All right. Well, thanks, John. And we'll move into Q&A now, and I've got a bunch there. So I'll just moderate them up to the panel, if that's all right. And some people have addressed their questions specifically to individuals. So I'll get myself off the screen in a minute and bring all of the panel up. But before I do that, it would be remiss of me not to or to miss the opportunity for a little bit of an unabashed pitch of the Liberal Democrats, if you wouldn't mind, John. Everybody that's joined us today, of which there's well over 1,000 or 1,300 watching the stream on YouTube, and I'm not sure about other distribution, and of course the several hundred in the Q&A audience in the town hall with us. If you're not aware of the Liberal Democrats, please take the time to go and check out our website at ldp.org.au. You'll see videos there, and also on the YouTube channel. If you're watching the stream on YouTube, take the time to look around the Lib Dem Australia YouTube channel a bit, and visit John Ruddick's Facebook page as well, because John's been posting a lot of good material. You'll see videos from Campbell Newman, who, like John, is a Senate candidate in this upcoming federal election. He's in Queensland. We've got 2 sitting members down in the Legislative Assembly in Victoria, in Tim Quilty and David Limbrick. Please follow them on Twitter and check out their videos on YouTube, and you'll get a good sense of what this party stands for. You know, I think the reason that John has come across from the Liberal Party is the same reason that Campbell Newman has, and the same reason many of us have, and stepped into the Lib Dems, and we find ourselves very comfortably sitting here with not only a bunch of people from the conservative side of politics, but also a lot of people from the centre-left of politics who, like many of us, have realised that we've taken for granted the basic freedoms and liberties in this country. You know, like the framers of our constitution, when they put our constitution together, the same in New Zealand, the same in Canada, as just took freedom and liberty for granted, and so did not enshrine the basic rights of freedom of speech, freedom of association into the Constitution. And I think when John Humphreys rather started this party back in about 20 years ago, as a lot of people looked at it and said, well, John, you know, you and the others, we appreciate your energy, but why do we need a party whose central principles are freedom and democracy, personal freedoms and personal liberties, as we've got all those things in Australia? Well, I think the last 18 months has demonstrated to most of us that on both sides of politics, is we should have never taken those things for granted. And it really is a time, this time now, for the Lib Dems to be front and centre. So please visit our website, and political parties get driven by membership, and you end up with politicians that you want, that reflect community needs and standards, if you join a party and if you participate in the process. And so we'd love everybody to consider joining the party as a full member. Unlike, I think, Labor and Liberal, as we want members of parties, we're not concerned about what they are concerned about, which is too many people showing up at branch meetings and ruining their cosy factional relationships. That's what's gone wrong with politics in this country. And so please, if you don't join the Lib Dems, join a party, for goodness sakes. Of course, we'd love you to join the Lib Dems, but the duty falls to all of us to stop just waiting to see what happens on election day, or to think that our participation in the process can be limited to that. Is get involved, and that'll wrap my pitch up. I think ldp.org.au, volunteer, donate, join, get involved, and if not with us, with somebody else, but of course we'd love it to be us. So let's get everybody up on the sorry, John, I promised I wouldn't go on too long, but I couldn't miss that pitch opportunity. Let's get everybody up. And we won't bring Andre up, and we might get rid of me to up here, and I'll switch my camera off. And I'll just feed some questions here. So one of the first questions we had, and I'm interested in this one. I'm interested in this one personally, actually, as a director of a public company. And I've been really interested in it, that my interest was amplified by Lyndall Dean, the Deputy President of the Fair Work Commission's report the other day, or her opinion / ruling, dissenting ruling. John, paragraphs, I think somebody's pointed them here to me. I'm just trying to find them. Paragraphs 144 through to 146 of that ruling. Our questioner here says, particularly with 146, Dean says, finally, it should be clearly understood that employers who mandate vaccinations will be liable for any adverse reactions their workers may experience, given this is a foreseeable outcome for some people. And I tell you what, as a director of a company, that puts the fear of God in me. I can assure you that our company won't be mandating vaccines, but if I was one of these companies that would put the fear of God in me. Perhaps the lawyers can talk to that one for me.
I'm happy to say something about that. I think that they're wrong, Keith. There is a whole slew of lawyers, particularly industrial relations lawyers, who have adopted this view that the only safe workplace is an entirely vaccinated workplace, and that is the only that is the bar that employers must leap. I think for the very reasons that. For some of the reasons David's pointed out, and other reasons that have been articulated by Steve, for instance, having a vaccinated workplace does not mean you're COVID-free. And so it can't, again, logically, it can't be the test. Now, this is many of the people in the bar who have been advising various government departments are suggesting that the government departments in particular mandate have a statutory obligation from a work health and safety aspect to mandate vaccination. Ultimately, I don't think that logically that can be held out. As one example, and this was published in yesterday's Australian newspaper, a very interesting article that quoted Brad Banducci, the boss of Woolworths, and that pointed out that of the 25,000 incidences of Woolworths staff in Victoria being required to go home and self-isolate after being what the Victorian government quotes as considers a close contact when somebody COVID positive have come into the store. So of 25,000 close contact incidents, not one single Woolworths employee who's been sent home to self-isolate has tested positive. So it is as a statistically significant pool of people, that shows you how remote the chances are of catching COVID in a normal workplace. And I think eventually rationality and logic and practicality are going to catch up with the hysteria of politicians and a few lawyers.
Robert, sorry, I think the point that was made by the questioner here was that Deputy President Dean made it very clear in what she said on COVID-19 vaccines that employers would be held liable for harm that came if they had mandated a vaccine and someone got an injury from the vaccine. So I think the issue that she was pointing to was this is a known risk that you can get injured from these vaccines, and an employer will be held liable. And she says it very unequivocally, I think, if you look at the ruling, will be held liable if the staff member gets an injury from a vaccine. So
I think that's certain. Yes.
Yeah.
Can I make another point too? Just with workplace health and safety laws, employers are obligated to rationally assess risk as well. So they must show their decision making behind the mandate. And I think they could get into some trouble if they simply just rely on, a chief health officer said such and such. I know in Europe they're starting to look at other alternatives such as blood tests for antibodies if you've had COVID previously, which gives you some immunity, whether you have been double vaxxed, or even the rapid antigen testing, because obviously if you don't have COVID, and your test comes back as you don't have COVID, you have very little chance of passing it on.
And Keith, can I just do that? I heard Jennifer Westacott make comment in regard to these vaccines, basically saying that from the Business Council point of view that they wanted to see mandates in place for vaccines. But in light of everything we've just spoken about here, I mean, the messaging from even not only the politicians, but I mean, here's the head of the Business Council saying, so it doesn't give a lot of confidence to those businesses underneath them that they think there's not a problem. They're just going to go with the mandates and think that everything's happy, but it's not.
If I'm right, the problem might even be more fundamental than that, because one of the prohibitions in the Disability Discrimination Act is seeking information from a person to figure out whether or not they're disabled. So I can't say, are you gay, mate? Because you might have HIV. I can't ask the question. Technically, I can ask the question around the kitchen table at home. That's still okay. But I can't ask it in any of the public spaces that are protected under Part 2 of the Disability Discrimination Act. So employers might even have a problem saying to their employees, are you vaccinated?
Indeed.
I've got a question here again for the panel, and it's from a small business owner that says, but in fact, there's a couple here that mirror the same. It's the same sort of question. One is in healthcare, the other is not, just a small business owner. And they say, and I'm assuming they're down in Victoria because of this sort of blanket coverage of all so-called essential workers. The other, I'm not sure where they are, but they've asked the question both. One in healthcare, one not. What's my position as an employer if I refuse to mandate this for my staff when I've got health bureaucrats and others telling me I must?
The most correct answer to that question is ask your lawyer. It's a nightmare. My whole point here is there's either a very simple solution or this is a lawyer's picnic for decades. Mm-hmm. And I know what the better course is. It's up to a judge to tell us what the legal course is. But as for an individual business, you're just going to have to spend money on lawyers. That's the situation our governments have put us in.
I think that's right. One of the astounding things about this is that somebody should have taken a union, for instance, a properly acting union, which few and far between, apart from Jack's, should be taking Qantas to court as a test case. I mean, Qantas has the right pool of employees, the great breadth of employees with a blanket mandate from the boss, and it would be the perfect test case to determine really what the scope is. Having said that, no one on these things, properly speaking, shouldn't be left to the courts. But if governments at all levels are going to abrogate their responsibility, then Qantas would be a good case to test.
And can I speak to that question too, Keith?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the person who was asking about the, employers who are being told they have to mandate, from the independent school sector, the risk to an independent school is that they'll lose their registration and not be able to operate as a school. My question then is, where do we stand with fair trading on that? Because, if they're infringing on our ability to function as a school, or even if we lose, a huge percentage of our staff, there's some sort of a restraint of trade going on, and I'd really love one of the legal brains to look into that. And insurance. So I've heard that the insurance companies will not back a school or an employer whose employee is injured by the vaccine. So we're in a conundrum here because the pharmaceutical companies have got no liability. We're unable to sue them if our employees are injured by the vaccine. So say as an independent school, an employee sues us because they're injured by the vaccine, for a mandate that we have had to impose because the government has done that. So do we bring the government in then as a second defendant? You know, ultimately, will the government be responsible? I can only speak from the independent school sector. These are questions.
Every time everybody opens their mouth, they come up with a new angle that no one's ever thought of, which is why we have things like Senate inquiries, public consultation and draft legislation. Just the abandonment of the lawmaking process here is just outstanding. I can't believe what's happening in my country. We're just all being told what we have to do.
No due process. There has been no due process. Please, John, drive that home. And
as John Anderson keeps pointing out on his podcast, you know, it is through public debate that we tend to land on the right answers here, and we haven't had one.
John, I might say that this problem of everyone needing to go to courts is being foisted upon us by a lack of rights. And so what is more important in the long term for everybody here is gaining some rights or having rights defined. One of the most concerning aspects of this whole scenario is that it has brought into very stark clarity the fact that for all of us who have grown up in Australia, who thought that we had rights, freedom of association, freedom of speech, bodily integrity, we didn't. You do not have rights. This is the shocking thing about this. What happened, some of us will remember that 30 years ago, there was a debate, quite an active debate in Australia, whether or not we should have a Bill of Rights as part of a constitution, and many lawyers were involved in that debate. And the overall result was that people sort of generally decided that we didn't really need a Bill of Rights because all of these natural rights that have been recognised for hundreds of years were kind of there and floating around in the ether and will be all right. What saved us back then and preserved these rights is that back then, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, no self-respecting government would have ever even contemplated stepping into this lacuna, this vacuum of rights, trespassing into what have been considered for hundreds of years as natural rights of people. And so what we suddenly have is governments of all persuasions who are prepared to, for the first time, to trespass into areas which were a vacuum, in which we sort of had rights because nobody else was challenging them. And so courts in Australia are infatuated with positive law. And so when you have no law, courts in Australia are extremely reticent to find law. And this will be applied, mark every lawyer's words, this will be applied to far more than COVID vaccines. When governments like Andrew's government and various other state governments around Australia and their bureaucracies have discovered that you can start shooting people in the street and banning public protests and banning freedom of association and impinging on your bodily rights, the integrity of your body, we have entered a new phase of life in Australia. So there's two really, truly shocking things about this. One is that we do not have these rights. And hopefully some of this litigation will create some or create some law that sets out some rights. And the second thing is that a huge number of people apparently don't care whether they have rights or not. This is why I have a theory that when you see many of the people out protesting, they come from backgrounds that are far closer to in time to authoritarian governments than some of us have been. They remember, dad remembers, or mum, grandma remembers authoritarian governments, communism or socialism or despotism in some way. And we as a nation have become too fat and complacent to go out and fight for our rights. And I think when we have people like Deputy President Dean, and some of you would have read the excellent Stuart Lindsay, a retired federal court judge who wrote in Quadrant magazine earlier in September. He really wrote a call to arms. He actually used the word revolt. He called people to revolt. And look, my personal view is unless people...
Can someone post a link for that article?
I'm happy to post a link. Unless people follow Angela and go out to a picket line or a protest and actually make their voice heard, if you don't revolt and we don't resist, if we don't all become activists, people like us, I suspect, who have never really been involved in protests in our lives, unless we do it now, these rights will have been evaporated forever. That's my serious, considered view. And I might say in the latter litigation, we have brought in 3 of the preeminent constitutional and rights professors in Australia. We have some very significant thinkers in John Larter's case, and they consider that this lacuna will be trespassed into government forever unless there is a substantial pushback by the people. So I look
when you peel back all the layers, it's actually a very straightforward policy shift, but being straightforward, it's still extremely disturbing. Up until last week, I had complete autonomy over what I stuck in my body. I've stuck some stupid things in my body over the years, but it is my body. But now that complete autonomy, some or all of it, the state of Victoria wants to take off me and give to some combination of the corporation and the state. I'm dead against that. I'm not going to have a bar of it. So that's why I got off my tractor and I'm sitting here talking to you.
John Ruddick, we've got a question here, and it might give you an opportunity to talk about a very important policy issue for the Lib Dems, and that is the issue of recall elections. And somebody said, with Dan Andrews and others spinning out of control, you know, our friends in many of the states in the United States have the option to get a recall going of their elected officials, and what say you about that and the option to achieve that in Australia? I think we'd all love to see it.
Okay, well, look, within the next few weeks, the Liberal Democrats are going to come out with their policy manifesto. Within that, we are going to be actively supporting a constitutional amendment which allows us to have recall elections. Now, recall elections are permitted in Switzerland and in some states in the United States, and I think some other jurisdictions. How it works is, if you have an election, either for a government or for a governor or even for a local member of an electorate, and the people during midway through their term do not like how they have behaved or they don't like their policies, if the people can then self-fund a petition where you might have, say, 5 or 10% of the electorate, which is a big task. If 5 to 10% of the electorate signs a petition saying we would like a recall election, which means that there's a fresh election. Now, and we recently had one of these in California. It's a big operation. Now, people who are critics of it will say, oh, well, we don't want people getting elected and getting challenged all the time. The reality on the ground is recall elections are rare. However, it is a very good thing to have on the books, because it means that elected officials know that if they do become dictatorial, that they've got the threat of a recall election, which is always very embarrassing for them. I think what would have happened now, if we had had constitutionally protected recall elections, I'm absolutely convinced Dan Andrews and others there would have been a sufficient percentage of the population that said, we want a new election, thank you, Mr. Premier, we don't like what you're doing. And just knowing that was an option would have constrained him. I just want to quickly touch on a couple of things Rob McCauley said about how sort of, disappointing how much lack of a fight there is out there, except for you good people, of course, and many, many others. But there's 2 very disappointing things that have happened in the last 18 months in Australia, and that is, in the Westminster system, it is designed so that when there is a contentious political issue, that our parliaments would sort of coalesce into two competing sides and we would have a free and fair debate. Now, what has happened here is that basically, I've called them the Lib Lab Party. They are basically lockstep on their COVID policy. There is no difference in our parliament. So this is why, and the Greens are the third biggest force in our parliaments at this time. They're all in agreement. Okay, so it means that the parliaments are meant to be a place of debating contentious issues. It simply not happens. Now, what happens when
they're all in agreement in not meeting as well? Most, as far as I'm aware, most parliaments are just not meeting.
Yeah, well, because most of these backbenchers have got nothing to say because they're cowardly people. Now, we have had some dissenters. We've had Tanya Davies heroically in New South Wales. We've had George Christensen and Craig Kelly. These and Matt Canavan, one or two others. Okay, there have been others, but look, and these people get demonised. They are elected officials, and when they've got a view on something contentious, we should be hearing it. Now, the other very disappointing aspect of the last 18 months is that our media are meant to be people that challenge authority, question authority, and are sceptical of our political leaders. Well, look, if anything, the vast majority of our media, you watch these dreadful press conferences every day, and it's like the media, all the media want to say is, why haven't you taken away more people's freedoms? Why haven't you been more coercive with the power of the state? So look, this is why, I had been a loyal member of the Liberal Party for 30 years. And I just thought, look, we do need a fresh start because there is something wrong. And Robert was saying, look, we've become sort of so fat and lazy in appreciating our rights. Do you know in the 20th century, the Australian economy had the highest per capita GDP growth in the whole world. The United States was second, but so Australia has been such a rich and prosperous country. And we've all our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have basically never, we might have fought in the wars and things in the Great Depression, but people have just never thought that our basic fundamental rights, we've always walked around proud how much of a free country Australia is. I think Robert is exactly right. We've become fat and lazy, and people, our kids, a couple of generations have been taught how bad Australian history is, how bad Western history is. I'm sorry, it's the greatest thing in the history of this planet that we've people over the last 300 years, going back to the 1500s, 1600s in Western Europe, particularly in England, fighting for freedoms, basic freedoms, and fighting for people to have more power than the state over their control of their lives. So I am hoping that this is going to be an example of darkest before dawn, and that we are in a crisis here about our rights. Hopefully, that enough people will wake up, and over the next this COVID episode, one way or another, is going to pass. Then hopefully, there's going to be enough people who say, "Look, we got to get involved in politics here, because if you don't take an interest in politics, politics will eventually take an interest in you."
Here,
John. And look, some really practical things to finish today off with, I think, is reach out, have a look at Jack's Red Union. There's lots of people getting organised in the workplace, and I think they need to continue to do that. Familiarise yourself with the different legal challenges that are going on. Push back against your employers. Stand up for your rights. I, for one, and certainly if anyone was mandating a vaccine for me, is the first thing I'd be asking a lawyer to do would be to draft a deed of guarantee and indemnity for whichever employer was asking me to get that vaccine. And again, as a director of a public company, I'll say to you, we've got directors and officers insurance, and I've got a director protection deed with the company. If someone asked me to sign a deed of guarantee and indemnity for mandating anything within the workplace, is the first thing I'd do is trundle off to the lawyers, and the next thing that they would do is trundle off to our directors and officers insurer. Well, I can tell you, I've done it just out of interest, and I got told in no uncertain terms by our D&O insurer, you will not have coverage. If you want to mandate a vaccine in the workplace, and if a worker dies or is injured, and them or their estate sues you, do not come looking to us as your D&O insurer to give you protection. It will fall to the company and to you individually and personally as a director. And so, somebody's mandating it, hand them the bit of paper and ask them to sign it. and I'd be doing that even if you intended to take the vaccine. And it'd be interesting to see what the response is.
That's right.
All right. Well, I'll just try and work out how to start my video and get me back up there. I think we might wrap it up now, John, as I think we've held everybody up for quite a long time, and really just like to thank all of you that have joined us today, both within the audience and of course also the panelists. So Robert McCauley, thank you so much, and Steve Bush, David Porter, Jack Maguire, Angela, thank you for joining us. And John Larder, keep fighting the good fight, my friend. It's been a magnificent thing. And so, John, maybe you'd just like to wrap up for us. And
well, look, I was going to say I've enjoyed this session. I mean, look, the whole process is not enjoyable. The whole thing, you know, we wish we didn't have to deal with this. But it has been very informative, and I can see on Twitter and Facebook a lot of people are saying that it's good to see other people who are standing up, and you know, and I think a lot of people have got some good information. So let's all keep in touch. And I guess the next milestone, Robert, would that be John Larter's case, or what's the sort of the next legal milestone from here? What's the next thing to keep an eye out for?
I think the Larter litigation will probably be the next big thing, but there are a whole lot of little things. There will be a whole lot of a whole slew of police cases to keep your eye on as well, which will no doubt.
When do we expect? When is John back in court next week?
No, so there will be some mentions and things, but the main game is the 3rd of November.
Right. Okay. Very good. Okay, well, look, maybe we can reconvene again, you know, sometime around then, and we'll. Are you on social media, Robert? How do people know about your updates?
I'm terribly afraid to say I'm a Luddite.
Okay.
But well, so perhaps Andre, or somebody who is better at social media, could post to other channels, both the David Porter article and the Stuart Lindsay article I was referring to. I have posted them both in links on this chat as we've been discussing, but both the Porter and Lindsay articles from the Spectator and the Quadrant are both excellent and worthwhile reading.
Okay, very good.
I'll put them on my Facebook page and Telegram page as well. I know the one from the Quadrant is there, so we'll definitely get David's out there as well.
Brilliant.
Okay. And Keith, thank you for organising it. This was actually largely Keith. I was talking to Keith last week, and I said, look, I'm just getting inundated with these people. And he said, look, let's do this thing. So Keith brought it together. So Keith, we're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Keith.
Thanks,
yes.
Keith.
thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
See you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.